We are facing a global climate emergency, so it's not business as usual. It's why Europe's 8 leading business schools are now working together to help prepare future business leaders for climate leadership. 8 business schools, collaborating on new research, reaching out to all 8 schools' influential alumni communities, developing a best practice toolkit for businesses. Visit our website to find out more and see details of our new webinar series, Business Schools for Climate Leadership. Climate leadership to the power of 8.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining this 4th webinar of the new group, Business Schools for Climate Leadership. I'm Peter Tufano, the former Dean of Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. As Dean, it was my responsibility to advance the interests of my school, my students, my alumni, my faculty. But at the same time, in class, we teach our students that the solution to systems problems lies in substantive collaboration beyond our boundaries. The implications of climate change for our planet, for humanity, societies, businesses, households, can't be overstated. The recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC report, makes clear the dire consequences of our continued pouring of greenhouse gases into the oceans and atmospheres. The extreme weather, heat domes, floods, droughts, storms that we've experienced in the past year, compounded with the problems of COVID, are a taste of what's ahead. So businesses need to act, but so do business schools. I'm proud to say that 8 of the leading European business schools have joined hands to work together to try to make a difference about climate change. Our founding partners are Cambridge Judge Business School, HEC Paris, IE Business School, IESE Business School, the International Institute for Management Development, or IMD, INSEAD, London Business School, and the University of Oxford Saïd Business School. We are teachers, researchers, conveners, and stewards of a collective alumni body that numbers over 400,000. We must continue to do much individually in our schools, but the demands of climate change require us to do more collectively. And so Business Schools for Climate Leadership is a partnership where our committed faculty and staff have joined together. Initially, we're producing a climate toolkit for business leaders, which will formally launch at the UN COP meetings on the 10th of November in Glasgow, Scotland, at the Sustainable Innovation Summit in partnership with Intent. In the run-up to COP, we're holding a series of unusual webinars with faculty from multiple schools presenting alongside one another with perspectives from both outside in about how external implications of climate change affect business, and from inside out, how businesses might need to cope with and change and help arrest the harmful effects of climate change. As I said, this is our 4th webinar, all of which are available on our website, bs4cl.org. In our first webinar, we had a great session with Mike Rosenberg from IESE and Mark Goulet from INSEAD, moderated by Catel Legulvan from INSEAD, looking at some of the macro implications of climate change. How does climate change amplify some of the already heightened tensions arising from inequality and geopolitical instability? Our second webinar highlighted the work of Conchita Caldon and her colleagues from IE, moderated by Knut Hannes from IMD and by me. What technologies and innovations are available to address the issues raised by climate change? Our third webinar focused on nature-based solutions and the need to decarbonize, led by our colleagues Jennifer Howard-Grenville from Cambridge and Daniel Habir from HEC, moderated by Mike Rosenberg from IE. Question there is, what's the core science and hence business urgency behind both decarbonization and nature-based solutions, which go beyond greenhouse gas emissions to consider biodiversity and other looming ecological catastrophes? So today and tomorrow, we look inside the firm. Today, how do businesses create new business models to capture the opportunities presented by the climate emergency? And the flip side of the same coin, how do firms measure and manage the risks faced by climate? Transition risks, fiscal risks, and other risks. I'm honored today to be joined by my colleagues from IMD, Professor Knut Hannes, the London Professor of Sustainability at IMD and a longtime BCG strategist, and by Natalia Olenek, who's the head of sustainability at IMD, where she works on research and programs. Joining me from Oxford Saïd is Professor Annette Mikes, who is an expert on risk management, management accounting, and accounting for sustainability. Annette, Richard Barker, and I co-authored the Toolkit chapter on risk management and climate. So before I turn it over to Knut and Natalia to start, I'm working on housekeeping. After some initial remarks, it'll be over to you. Please post your questions on social media platforms, and then I will make sure to ask them to the panel. You can ask questions via the chat function on whatever platform you're watching. Please keep them brief and tell us both who you are and where you're from. Well, let's get started. Over to you, Knut and Natalia, to get us started.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I just want to start by saying this feels really meaningful. We're addressing an issue which is kind of a uniquely important one. We know we can't address it alone. We have to work together. And now we're trying to work together across the business schools. It's really a great occasion. And then secondly, I'd say business schools are important in this. Business will be a very important part of addressing climate and the climate catastrophe that we are facing. It's a big part of the solution. And let's talk a little bit about why it's so important and also what can be done to address it from the business perspective. So the first thing I want to say, business transformation is critically important. There, from a business perspective, two forces. There's the disruption, all the new technologies. The world has 1.3 million tech startups that are coming up with new solutions. Many, if not most of them, will have positive climate impact. So that's a good thing in itself. And then secondly, all established companies. And they will be so important to taken together. So there's lots of research in this area, but for me, important to mention is only something like 30% of the solution on climate reductions will be driven by the consumer. 70% will have to be driven by companies and investments. And then hopefully with strong governmental action. Why is business so important? Well, business is important because business can scale, change fast and adapt and drive new innovations. And that's really the force we have to unleash. And there are huge opportunities. So it feels like we are having two sides of the same coin here. One is the anxiety and all the kind of uncertainties related to climate change. On the other side of the coin, there are all the opportunities as well. There are, from a company perspective, huge opportunities related to renewables, circular economy, new business models, etc. And it's our job to channel that and help companies and future leaders take those opportunities in a responsible way. Last point, business can't do this alone. This is a team sport, not only between companies, but public, private, local communities, etc. This is something where we all have to learn to work together, which is also why I would say these 8 business schools are really committed to work together. Business transformation. If you look at all our companies, in the European Union, there are 500,000 companies there are 500,000 companies that need to be transformed. 500,000 companies, that's just in the European Union. And what is that transformation? Well, from our perspective, when we work with companies, it's of course about understanding the strategic side of it, the what, the head, the strategic. But there's also the heart, the change management, the leadership, the purpose, and the commitment. And then there's the hands, making this work together. And our job, I think, is to work with current and future leaders to drive these solutions about how we transform our companies in a world where actually climate represents both responsibility, but also a huge opportunity. And this is helped by many, including investors. So a recent study showed that 5% of private equity investments are now driven by, in some kind of way, ESG. A lot of it related to energy. And that's, I guess, Natalia, a good transition into a few examples.
Absolutely. Thank you, Knut. What's really exciting is that we're seeing many businesses move from talk to real action. They're innovating to transform themselves, but also entire industries. So if we look at a few examples, we have AP Moller-Maersk, the biggest shipping company in the world. Their ambition is to decarbonize shipping. That's a huge task. As a first step, they've ordered 8 large vessels that will be running on carbon neutral fuel. But they can't do it alone. Their Center for Zero Carbon Shipping is uniting stakeholders throughout the supply chain to help support this transition. Then there's Royal DSM. Royal DSM is supporting the shift from intensive farming methods to regenerative agriculture. The company is reducing the environmental footprint of the dairy industry. They're cutting the production of methane by cows by introducing innovative animal feed. And then there's Nestle, the global food and beverage giant that is located here in Switzerland. They're noticing a substantial shift in consumer preferences towards sustainable products. And so they're investing a lot into research into how they can transfer all of their packaging into either recyclable or reusable packaging within the next few years. Now, none of these companies have all the answers. They're not perfect. However, they are asking some bold questions and creating some unique partnerships in order to scale their impact.
And it's quite interesting, Natalia, that if you look at sort of the examples over the last decade, I'd say that if we kind of go back 10 years, we looked a lot at the sustainability crisis. And of course, they occur still, but maybe to a lesser extent, maybe we have learned something. In any case, we're now increasingly starting to understand and learn from sustainability successes as well. And successes are not the idea. Successes are the scaling of the idea into something bigger. But this is learning as we go. And there are so many issues we have to go deeper into and so many concerns business leaders have to think through as well. So we wanted to mention 3, but there are many others as well. The first one is, what are the social consequences of the transition? What is a just transition? What is it that happens around the company as a consequence of the changes taking place due to the renewables revolution, due to new circular solutions, etc. So that's important. That's something that has to do with the existence of the company and the social license of the company over time. Second topic is the circular economy. The circular economy has huge potential. In the US, 28% of all waste is recycled, whereas 80+% could be used profitably in recycling. So we have lots of things we can do. I also saw recent studies showing that 39% of the energy challenge can be solved partly through circular solutions as well. So this is a big one. And we see very interesting new business models emerging as a consequence of us thinking differently around the circular economy. Big one. Third one is, I think we're a reflection of that, is systems. Solving climate, addressing climate is a systems challenge. No one company can solve it alone. Companies can't solve it alone. We need the partnerships and we need the different players to play along. And we need to learn. That's kind of the missing equation of leadership development in some ways, something we have to take into account, that we need to teach future leaders not only to run their company, but also to lead, shape, and craft systems for finding bigger solutions. But all of this taken together is really business finding a new job to be done and leadership developing to do that job. And this, the digital booklet we're doing together, the 8 schools, has different chapters. Some are outside in, some are inside out. This one on the business transformation. I think we're working together to create learning, knowledge, and a new dialogue around key issues on climate, including the issue of business transformation. It's almost like the ultimate leadership challenge of our time, Peter.
Well, great. Natalia and your co-author, Julia, thanks for that contribution. We'll have a chance to ask many questions in a moment. As you point out, we have to think about systems, because not only as business schools do we have to train people to be successfully individually and in teams and in their organizations, we also need them to train them in order to be successfully at the systems level. So I mentioned at the beginning that risk and opportunities are two sides of the exact same coin. Because the future is uncertain and because we have agency, we can and must deal with future uncertainties. And in business schools for climate leadership, we see climate as the defining element of that future. If we look at the risk side of the coin, what are the risks that firms are dealing with in terms of the climate? How do they measure these risks? And organizationally, how will they deal with them? This question is the one that Annette, who's about to speak, has been studying along with me and with Richard Barker, and it's a major part of her research agenda. So let's flip for a moment from opportunity to risk and understand risk management in a time of climate emergency. Over to you, Annette.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Knut and Natalia, for setting this up so nicely. We do know there are a lot of opportunities out there. We do know that there are projected investments in the range of $1 to $2 trillion a year being directed into the green energy transition. But we are probably right to ask, what are the risks to this transition? Because the biggest risk that we are running as society is that we are not going to make use of the next decade, which is supposed to be a critical decade on the way to decarbonization. And the reason I'm saying we have a reason to worry is that we have been before. In 2006, after some significant increase in climate change awareness following works like Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, we have been here. The economist Nicholas Stern and his working group identified the challenge of climate risk as an economic issue, and in 2006 they issued a report calling on governments and businesses to invest in the range of about 1% of the GDP for the coming 20 years in order to undertake the clean energy transition. They also quantify the opportunity cost, the cost of not acting, which they put at 20% of GDPs. So we seem to have a clear reason to act on the call for reacting to climate challenge. And yet that didn't happen. 2016, we took a 10-year stock of developments, and for various reasons, we were disappointed. Still, $1 trillion a year went into subsidizing the fossil fuel complex. When we need that level of investment subsidy effectively in the other direction, we now seemingly having a different chance, another opportunity. This is to do with unprecedented societal pressure that has been put on governments around the world in the last, I would say, 5 years, and governments are reacting. So finally, the wind is in our sails, as so to speak. We have got the EU formulating a very ambitious 55% reduction over the next decade in emissions at 1990 level. The US is making commitments in the range of 43% reduction this decade, and the UK, even more ambitiously, is pledging a close to 70% reduction by 2030. Overall, this decade it could be a watershed decade for us. If we manage to do this, then we're going to have that faith, that confidence back that we can transition to a green and energy future. This, of course, raises the question of who is paying for this. As Knut was saying, a lot of this is going to be expected to be undertaken by business investment, by consumers paying for green or low carbon products. But of course, it cannot be done without government help, without government subsidies, and without governments creating the policy frameworks. This creates a very unique risk environment for companies trying to solve this problem. So if we move to the next slide, please. I'm going to be able to look inside companies and see what they are doing on their risk management front related to climate risk. Of course, we are seeing that many risk managers who've been used to the management of strategic or operational risks are nervous. They feel that with climate risk, they are a little bit out of their depths. We can see that in reviews undertaken among professional risk managers by their own professional association, GARP. 85% of people are feeling that they will need additional knowledge. So there is a corporate expertise gap in this area, which of course we need to fill. Business schools have an opportunity here to step up and educate not just risk managers, but the managers of the near future to understand climate risk, not just as a business and economic issue. Of course, it's an opportunity, but it also has got elements of geopolitics, trade policy, and of course we need to get a better understanding of the science behind it. Another reason why risk management managers and perhaps executives are nervous about climate risk is that in this domain, they are being asked to deal with a system level issue with the tools and approaches of an individual company, which is of course a mismatch of levels of analysis. This means that corporations, as Natalia said, need to step outside their comfort zone and start interacting and liaising with other corporations, other business associations, lobby groups, and institutionally important actors such as governments and regulators and higher level governmental agencies such as the EU. So they need to undertake the institutional work that will create the policy framework within which they can respond to the climate risk challenge. Many of the companies that I talk to or we talk to suggest that their biggest risk is bad policy making. Of course, climate risk poses its own risks. In many ways, climate is a novel risk. Let's move on to the next slide. Risk managers are used to dealing with routine risks, which they normally represent in colorful risk maps, such as the picture you see in the middle of this slide. If we can assess the probability and the impact of a risk, we can create plans about how to deal with it, how to mitigate it, should it happen, how to reduce its probability of occurrence. The nature of climate risk is that it contains too much uncertainty compared to what we are used to in order to be in the realm of routine risk management. So how do we approach this conceptually? At one level, businesses are now seeing climate risk as a combination of two things. There is a physical risk component, the risk that extreme weather events are going to harm their physical assets, their communities, their employees, their supply chains, potentially their consumers. There's a very real physical risk, which has been underlined by recent occurrences of extreme weather events. And there is a transition risk component. This is the risk of the world transitioning in such a speed or such a way that some corporations are not able to keep up or becoming irrelevant or fail because they cannot do this. So this transition risk is to a large part policy risk, but also to a large part innovation risk. Do companies have what it takes in order to bring on the technologies needed, create the new lower carbon products that are needed for the green energy transition? And because of these risks, we also have potential occurrences of this on scales we have never seen before. There is no routine occurrence of physical risk anymore when we are seeing larger and larger manifestation of extreme weather events. So we started to talk about some of these risks is no longer routine weather risks. They are sort of tsunami risks occurring at an unprecedented scale, often overwhelming our existing reaction or control capabilities. Think of the flooding last summer in Germany's Rhine region, when we saw rainfall in 2 days twice as much as normally anticipated in a typical July month, and the havoc it created. We can also think of climate-related risks in combination, in very unexpected combinations that can create so-called perfect storms in the risk space. So we could have extreme weather events like droughts coupled with economic and social events such as food shortages or food price rises, leading to social unrest or even forced migrations. These combinations are very complex, very difficult to anticipate, and when they occur, again, they threaten to overwhelm our control capabilities. And finally, we mustn't discount the possibility that there could be real black swan events related to climate risk, partly because scientists are telling us there are some trigger points and threshold events that even them cannot predict should we reach those thresholds. So overall, from a risk management point of view, we have to keep a very open mind of what are those threats that we need to face here. From a risk management point of view, however, there is also another side of this. There is also the opportunity side of things. Businesses that are reacting in time, capturing the kind of wave of social demand for action, might actually come out on top of these events and are able to help us bring about the technologies that over the long term will reduce the probability of terrible, disastrous, novel risks occurring in this space. Shall we move on to the next slide? Okay, so how can businesses do this? One of the risk considerations that we see across various sectors, and in particular in this work I'm undertaking with co-author Marcel Metzner on some of the most carbon intensive industries in Europe, is that companies are seeing they have got very different starting points. They have different technological endowments. Some are more dependent on the fossil fuel complex than others. They've got different abilities to pass on the cost of transition to their customers based on their regulatory and their industry and market conditions. And finally, there is a significant difference in the availability of low carbon technologies occurring across various industrial contexts. So while utilities have got a lower and lower cost alternative to high carbon energy generation, the steel industry is still looking for the breakthrough technology that is going to deliver us what will become hopefully one day green steel. Because of these differences, if we go to the next slide, we will see that the way companies respond to climate risk involves a number of different what we call strategic responses. So in the lost decade of 2006 to 2016, research shows that a lot of companies responded to climate change and climate change risk with defensiveness. Some of them even try to obfuscate the issue and avoid the issue by lobbying against policymakers even acting on this. This is because their own economic self-interest was at stake by what they considered to be potentially dangerous and not well thought through transition moves. Those defensive strategies we find in the European Union context are no longer tenable. All companies that used to have anything remote to that are now moving away from that. Ideally, companies would like to say we are doing the green transition. We would like to set that as an objective. But the reality, as I said, is that for some of them, this is just not an option currently. So before they can get to green transition, they've got two different paths that they can take or a combination of those two. Some companies try to do it alone and feel that because of some of the technologies of low carbon production are becoming available gradually as they are investing in this, there is an opportunity for them to create green business segments in which they can charge a premium for these investments and create green markets. So we see it occurring in the chemical industry and in the energy power industry more and more. However, in industries where those technologies are still far into the future or relatively far into the future, what companies can do is try to create the policy environment that helps them to get there faster. So the steel industry is a prime example of this. They are now lobbying very heavily, not just their government, but EU governmental stakeholders to try to ask them to help them create the policy environment in which they could start producing or investing into the technologies we need. We are talking about investments at a level of $10 billion a year per steel company. Should these be matched by governmental subsidies or policies that create green borders, it would be much more difficult, much more easy for them to justify these investments. Okay, and the example for this, of course, if we go to the next slide, is a company that we have been doing some research on, Peter, Richard, and myself. ArcelorMittal is a very interesting case. If ArcelorMittal can do green transition, that's going to inspire most heavy industry companies, because then they can do it too. They are one of the most engaged companies in the policy debate at the moment. They are very committed to what they consider as ambitious target for decarbonization. And there is a race for creating green steel among the industry participants, which is very exciting. Their target is to create the world's first fully fossil fuel free steel plant in Europe, in Spain, by 2025. This is a hugely ambitious target and inspirational as well. Of course, it cannot be done without support from a multiple expert function and staff functions and the enthusiasm and energy of engineers who are going to work on these new technologies. So as Knut said, this is very much a team sport. This is very much a contact sport in which risk management and sustainability play a role of not just pulling these actors together internally, but also liaising with stakeholders and carrying out the necessary institutional work that's required to facilitate this transition. One of the tools that we also discovered as helping them doing it is scenario planning. So again, this is another opportunity for business schools to include important new approaches and expertises that perhaps we haven't taught that much, but our future managers will need tremendously. I'm going to stop here and allow our audience to ask questions. And of course, Peter, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Annette. There's much more, which you'll all be able to read in the final toolkit, which will be released in a few weeks. So to kick off the discussion, first of all, to the audience, thank you for a couple of questions. Please add some more. Ask questions via the chat function on whatever platform you're watching, and tell us who you are and where you're from. So I'm thrilled to join, to have Knut and Annette join myself, and joining us today is Professor Julia Binder, who's Professor of Sustainable Innovation and Business Transformation at IMD. She is one of the co-authors on the IMD chapter. Her expertise includes teaching and researching sustainability in organizations with a focus on sustainable innovation, entrepreneurship, and marketing. And with that, maybe we'll start the first question. Starting with Knut and Julia. It's common wisdom, though not necessarily complete, that incumbent firms are much more likely to develop new business models under competitive threat, whereas startups, and Julia, I know you study them, are more likely to develop new models when they see a competitive opportunity. Some businesses have internalized climate into their strategies, others not so much so. How would you describe the current stage of climate adaptation in firm strategies?
Julia,
should I start?
Yeah, why don't you start? I'll add to it if you want.
Thank you so much, Peter. I think it's a very interesting question, because in many ways, 10 years ago, I think we would not have had a panel like this one, right? So many of us have been in this sustainability and management area for quite some time. And I think there's really some traction and some momentum. And this has for sure reached the business world. Annette mentioned no company nowadays can afford to have a defensive or reactive strategy when it comes to sustainability. So I think really we're living in a very exciting time at the moment. And I see that there's a lot of momentum on the firm side as well. So I think it's quite easy to say it's only startups that innovate, right? Because in many ways, they have it much easier. They're small, they're agile, they're flexible. Corporates have to safeguard a legacy. They have a huge responsibility vis-a-vis stakeholders, employees, suppliers, and so on. So I think in many ways, this is a system as well. And startups play a very important role in kind of pushing the boundaries, in showing that truly holistic and inclusive organizations are possible. And they're really pushing the companies in the right direction. But at the end, it's really a systemic effort. So we need industrial change. So it's not enough if some actors in a sustainable niche are changing. We really need this change on a larger scale. And with this respect, I think I'm much more positive than I would have been 5 years ago, because I really see that times are changing and that much more is happening also on a corporate side, where this is really integrated at the core of the business and not any longer as we're doing business as usual and we're planting a tree in Madagascar, which kind of offsets our efforts on that front.
Great. Now, Julia, your answer kind of indicated that this is becoming more of a global phenomena. Cecilia is asking, many of the examples that you've cited, and I think both the IMD and the Oxford examples are Western companies. How do we bring Chinese industries on board? Anybody want to take that?
I can start, and then so I just want to start by exactly where you ended, Julia, and then try to take it into a bit of a global picture. I think what you're describing, Julia, which I really subscribe to, is we have technology startups, and the world has 1.3 million of them. They are, for large part, disruptors. They create what's new. And then we have all established, large and medium-sized established companies. They are renewers. They need to renew themselves because we can't just keep doing what we're doing today. So this, taken together, is a massive force. This is a global phenomenon, and climate is a global phenomenon. And that's what we're increasingly seeing. So Peter, we had a discussion around IFRS, you know, the accounting standards on Friday. And it's easy to think, well, this is something that's going to come early in the US and then maybe Europe. And then, no, it's actually going to happen globally much faster than we think. And if I then apply the same logic to companies and sort of ask, where do we see the biggest innovations? I would say we see enormous energy-related innovations coming out of China. In the other places in Asia, no doubt, we see it, of course, in the US, but also South America. There will be pockets of innovations globally, and we will need them because they, in many cases, solve different problems. And maybe I'll say that at the end here, when it comes to sustainability and climate, there is the top-down technology, future-oriented, etc. That's kind of the top-down innovation. But then there's the bottom-up local communities dealing with the here and now, dealing with the scarcity issues, coming up with more efficient local solutions, etc. That's the bottom up. The world needs both, and we find both if we look across the world. And I think that's the picture which is emerging, Peter.
Great. Let's stick on that for a moment, and I want to take a question that Eric's asked and combine with, you know, kind of an intro by me. At business schools, we often talk about how it is that we're changing students' mindsets. For example, you know, having them have a growth mindset where they see themselves as an opportunity for change and improvement. Recently, I was talking to the head of sustainability for a major consulting firm, and he said that some firms view this issue as climate as a burden, others see it as a risk or a threat, and yet others see it as an opportunity. So Eric's question in mind, which is, what innovation skill sets, and I would add mindsets, will be needed for systems transformation that we don't currently have at global companies?
Great. Annette, do you want to get started? And then yes, we can maybe add to it.
Yes, thank you. Yes, the first reaction to this, that is really important how people and executives and managers of the future frame the climate issue. We know it from previous research on environmental risk. So this was around the era when we were worried about large companies polluting the environment. In the 70s and 80s, companies that formulated pollution risk as an opportunity were much more likely to innovate solutions that were commercially viable. And companies that treated this as a regulatory burden, as a threat, were much less innovative in this space, and they were fighting these changes with various defensive strategies. I think something similar is bound to happen in relation to climate risk, with a bit of modification, that there is a much bigger sense of this being a global issue and everyone can just be swept away with this tide of, actually, we are all in the same boat, as it were, Earthship or spaceship Earth. And this is our potentially last row of the dice, or potentially our great opportunity to stop what could be a global catastrophe. Now, pulling it back a little bit to today's world, there is no doubt that there is an institutional environment still out there around companies that makes them feel a lot of pressure for short-term financial performance. So no one should underestimate, the logic of, or the pressure of shareholder imperative, the shareholder value imperative that's still out there in force. And so there are still recent surveys from McKinsey showing that 70% of executives believe that if there was a conflict, a trade-off between short-term and long-term imperatives, their CEOs would make the trade-off the short-term way. So we still have this issue of trying to change short-term mindset to be much more long-term. How will we do this? We need to change the narrative, but we also need to change the institutional, potentially the legal environment. We now know from the Saïd Business School how we would go on about it. We would want to change the mandate, the role, the purpose of the corporation. If it was legally mandated to treat the maintenance of natural capital as an end in itself, then directors and company managers wouldn't have to make this terrible trade-off between short-term investments in a long-term sustainable future and the long-term.
So one solution is this kind of change in laws and regulations, but Knut and Julia, what other things would change the mindsets of the managers and executives that are going to have to move to transform their businesses?
So Julia, I see you're saying something. You go first, please.
Thank you, Knut. Next time I'll let you go first. Annette, you mentioned a lot of aspects already, and many of which I completely subscribe to. I think what you also highlight, and what is very, very important, a lot of the questions that we're asking here mean for leaders that it's full of paradox and dilemma. These are not easy trade-offs. These are not easy decisions. So I think what we need really is this changing the rules of the game, because it will make it much more easy for corporations to act in this kind of playground as well. But on top of that, I think to some extent, we need to move away from this competition mindset to have more of this co-opetition mindset. We mentioned it several times today. This is not one single player that is changing and our problems will be solved. This requires cooperation on a level that we have never seen before, and literally on all kinds of levels, right? We're talking about the corporate level, on the institutional side. So it really requires a co-opetition on a completely novel level. And this doesn't mean that we don't need to have any competition, but we don't need to compete on sustainability. We don't need to compete when it's about saving the planet, right? So I think this is something that really needs to change, and that is not naturally in our, let's say, corporate DNA. This is something we need to bring into this corporate DNA. And then it's this entrepreneurial mindset. And I like what Annette mentioned. In my entrepreneurial studies, we looked a lot at how do entrepreneurs manage to reframe problems into opportunities, because it sounds so easy, but it is so difficult. Because if you get presented with all this information that is really surrounded by this negativity, how do you actually get out of it and reframe it in a way that it sounds like a positive business opportunity? And I think in many ways, the SDGs have helped to pave the way in this direction, because they really provided this more of a communication tool of this is something actionable, and we can contribute in a meaningful manner, and this is something positive. And I think we need much more of this, and we need to bring it much more in the corporate world, that basically the SDGs and the sustainability challenges we are facing are at the same time the biggest pool of business opportunities. And there's so much money that investors would be happy to invest in solutions of that sort as well, that I think it's really about changing the narrative alongside changing the regulatory environment.
Great, thank you, Julia. Knut, did you want to add in?
I just wanted to mention that not only do we want to teach students, leaders of the future, a different mindset, but I think they already have a different mindset. I think they actually want to work in places that they can be proud of, that have a purpose, that are trying to be part of the solution, etc. So I think across the world, we are seeing this kind of move towards a different mindset. It's not making profit short term, but it's also taking a responsibility for some of these huge challenges. And that's good because business has to step up to it, I would say.
So we tend to, as participants in this initiative, have that growth mindset or optimistic mindset, but there's some of the evidence is not as positive. So let's at least deal with that. And so first I'll ask a question about your toolkit, and then I want to pick up some of the questions in the chat. So in the toolkit chapter that IMD has put together, that's going to be launched again on the 10th of November at the Sustainable Innovation Forum at COP26, you lay out a timeline for some other historical social innovations that got embedded in business activities. And if I read it correctly, for example, the recognition of the link between tobacco and cancer and the changes in business have taken decades. We don't have decades for the climate issue. So how do we accelerate the action around climate in a way that doesn't follow the same path that we saw between tobacco and cancer, or what Annette pointed out, which is a decade lost between 2006 and 2016?
I think this is the big challenge, right? We are stepping up to the challenge. We are building the institutions, the collaboration, the science, knowledge, etc. We are building the practices as well, but we're not doing it fast enough. So the real question is, what are going to be the accelerators here? There are almost like two ways that can happen. We can get together and create them through governments and collaboration, or it will be natural disasters. It's one of the two. On COVID, it was a disaster that mobilized and we changed very fast. On climate, hopefully we can do many of the changes we need to do before we absolutely have to. And I'd say we already have to, but from a kind of extreme perspective have to. When it came to the ozone layer, we actually were able to move constructively together before we absolutely had to. And my hope is that we will be able to do something similar on climate, but the jury is out. The real question is speed here, I think, the real question.
Others?
Maybe to add to this, I think two dimensions, and one was mentioned by Knut already. The sense of urgency is very important. And I think this is what we've really seen with COVID. If there is a sense of urgency, we can get together as a global community and solve problems in record time in a very innovative way. So I think it's a matter of putting climate really on the agenda, and this globally, and this is across industries and sectors. And the second one is technology from my perspective. I think technology is one of the aspects. Nothing scales and speeds up as much as technology does. And we see more and more technological solutions that now address climate problems. And this is what makes me hopeful, despite I can be very much discouraged as well, Peter. So I feel you, and I feel that there is also this side of the coin where we can be easily discouraged because nothing is changing quickly enough. But at the same time, we need to acknowledge these institutions have built up over centuries, and now we need to change them almost overnight. But I really believe if we get the sense of urgency right, and if we get technologies to actually really help us in this way to really scale up positive solutions, then I'm hopeful that we can actually turn the wheel around.
So Matthew Jones from Cambridge asks a provocative and really hard question that I think all of us have to answer. Why should we believe that business can be trusted to resolve the climate crisis? Who'd like to start on that one? And thank you, Matthew, for that question. You know, the hallmark of a great education is critical questions, and that's about the core of everything. So I can go ahead, Annette, please.
Yeah, I know where this is coming from. Matthew probably also studied or has been exposed to the notion of merchants of doubt. In that last decade, many businesses actually played a very reactive or reactionary role with regards to climate change. And one of the reasons why we lost that decade is that the fossil fuel complex lobbied against any meaningful change. Now, this has been well documented. This is not my research, but what my research is that we can't do this without the institutional framework being right for business to align their incentives, which are primarily still financial, with the incentives or with what society needs, which is to act on this decarbonization imperative. We can create that alignment if we change some of the levers, some of the dials. I come from an accounting and risk management background. From an accounting point of view, this is a question of redefining success, redefining what we consider to be true profit, understanding that not all profit that companies are currently earning are earned without causing detriments to the environment or to natural capital or even to social capital, which is going to be our next frontier probably. So the challenge is an accounting challenge, and at some level, and if we were able to carry out the transition from current accounting to what we here at Saïd Business School call sustainability accounting, that would move, that would change a lot of the dials that we are looking at. So for example, imagine a profit figure that internalizes the negative externalities that companies are imposing on climate or on their ecological environments. This will require, of course, a completely different skill set added to the current skill set of accounting. But in our assessment, this is not impossible. It's challenging, but it's doable. Another part of it is, of course, counting emissions. If we want to clamp down on emissions, we need to have a reliable measurement system that allows companies to set sensible targets. And we know that the current GHG protocol is not sufficient for most companies to translate or create even those targets for themselves. We need to move accounting to focus to make sure that we can count emissions, not just at the corporate level, but also at the level of individual products. So we will be able to count emissions across the value chain. Is this doable? Yes. Is this difficult? Yes. But we do have the background to it in the form of inventory accounting, in the form of understanding how activities are occurring in a company. Recent publication by one of our university colleagues, Kartik Ramana, with an HBS professor, Bob Kaplan, is talking about this. So from an accounting point of view, I feel that by changing these frameworks, changing this definition of success, we can also change the incentives of business.
So with accounting, we can hold firms accountable, but I don't think that gets us all the way to the trust question that Eric asked.
So let me take a quick stab, and then maybe Julia wants to continue on it. So if I take the kind of value creation perspective first, and then I'll go to identity and purpose afterwards. On value creation, 60% of the S&P 500 have huge stranded assets, so they have to deal with their assets. That's kind of the downside. On the upside, we also see that companies that deal proactively with climate, they actually perform better. So there's a strong economic argument for addressing climate. And then there's the identity, or maybe the purpose side of it, which is kind of more the softer side of it. I just see how talent goes to those who are part of the solution, where partners actually prefer to work with companies that are proactive and try to shape the environment, etc. Neither of those alone says we can trust companies. And it's we almost have to de-average as well. They're not every company that can be trusted, not every, but as an overall, my overall sense is that we'll increasingly be able to trust companies on dealing with climate. But as always, companies need the frameworks to compete within and collaborate within. And they're not all there, but they're coming in place. And IFRS is one example. So I come out where I think Matthew asks the question, critical, but I believe, and I also hope, and in a way we don't have any choice, but hoping that the company they will have to be part of this solution, I would say.
So I'm going to pick up two questions. Dr. Omar Kamara and Nanik, excuse me for mispronouncing the name, from INSEAD. I'll try to merge the two together. What are your thoughts on the role of public policy in facilitating measurable impact? And do you see regulation on pricing of free natural resources? And more generally, where does the panel see? Accounting is great. Business opportunities are showing that you can make money here. Purpose is becoming more important to young people and becoming more important to the employees. But what's going to be the appropriate role for public policy and regulation in order to facilitate and especially accelerate business activities here?
Julia, do you want to go?
I mean, I feel we have touched upon this already. I really feel that it's the role top down. It's the role to set the framework right. It's about to put the conditions right. Bottom up, like when we talk about what can corporations, what can startups, what can consumers do, they can all have this important pinpricks and move in the right direction. But at the end, we need the right framework to actually do business. And I think this is the role for me, for public policy, to get this right. And I'm not saying it's easy. But I truly believe, I mean, again, the first step was the UN Agenda 2030. Unfortunately, it has not translated in all facets into national legislation as we would have hoped for. But I believe, I mean, this is the direction we need to go. We need to put the framework right for business to actually do business right in this framework, right? And just to briefly touch upon the previous question, link it here, I do believe that a lot of trust will be gained back when we're very transparent as companies. And if we are able to communicate to the customers as well what we are doing, and that we're maybe not changing overnight because there are so many, because it's such a systemic issue and you need to get so many things right. But I believe that open and transparent communication, and whether this is part of public policy or corporates, would actually help to gain back trust, a lot of trust that has been lost over the last decades, where there was a lot of greenwashing that basically did not help us to move in the right direction.
Great.
From my point of view, may I just
add please.
Into that? We have research that shows that public policy works best when it combines both sticks and carrots. So in this climate change space, you would expect that public policy will be formulated around taxing carbon emissions in a way that incentivizes companies to make the right investment choices, shift away from fossil fuel-based electricity generation and into clean energy. But also there could be carrots. There are already proposals out there about how you can give benefits to companies that are good at drawdown. So there is this notion of the carbon coin, for example, rewarding firms for drawdown, or there is the notion of course, working with companies, facilitating the technology by creating grants and subsidies. So when you take all these policy measures in combination, I think we have got a better chance of creating the alignment that's needed for us to trust business better.
Great.
And Peter, just quickly, just to build on that very quickly, I just saw a recent study by McKinsey where they say that the demand for carbon credit is going to go 15 times, so grow 15 times by 2030 and 100 times by 2050. And that says something about this acceleration we're part of. So, I mean, I think that's an important part of this. What are the drivers of change on the policy level as well?
Absolutely. And as researchers, we can look at things like, how carbon credits are traded, how that system works, cap and trade, taxation methods. Someone asked a question about CDM, the clean development mechanism, why that didn't work as much as it could have. But in the last 2 minutes or so, what I'd like to do is to give, Annette and Newt and Julia a last word in terms of kind of your takeaways from the work that you've done so far. So a minute each or a little bit less, maybe start with you, Julia.
So I think what is important is to understand that we're dealing with a very systemic issue, and that we need to understand ourselves as embedded actors in this change and in this transformation that we're currently seeing. I do believe that we have reasons for hope. We see in many ways that startups are pushing the boundaries, that businesses transform, and some of them really transform from, let's say, oil and gas to become the leader in renewable energies. So I think what we see is that there are really reasons for hope that business can transform, that business do transform. And I think there's still lots to do and lots to achieve. And many of the topics we picked upon is getting the framework right. And I think even with this respect, what I see positive is in Germany, for instance, all companies at the German index basically have required the new government to actually set more and clearer regulations on sustainability, because they want to act in this framework and they want to have a clear framework to act upon. So I think there are reasons for hope, but I still acknowledge that we have a long way to go.
Hope, but a long way to go. Annette, over to you for a brief comment.
Okay, my takeaway so far, this is a deeply values-based discussion, not just value at risk, but there are multiple values at risk here. Among them, of course, are how we think about the ecological or the natural environment as something that that should be formulated as an end on its own right. So once we go through that value transition, we've got a much better chance of treating it not instrumentally, but in a way that allows us to responsibly maintain it. Another value that we have been underestimating so far is future generations. I think it's fair to say that, you know, by the discounting method, economists have basically turned away from future generations, but we should not blindly believe that they will be just richer and more powerful than with us. We are responsible for them as well. And as the Iroquois nation says, we are working for the 7 generations before and after us as well.
Okay, Knut, last word.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, with climate comes a new job, but also a new purpose for business schools. And we have to take it, and we can't take it alone. So I'll actually end by thanking Annette and Peter and Julia for collaborating. I think that's the best way we can address this.
Well, I will pick up from there. Thank you, Knut. Thank Julia. Thank Natalia. Thank Annette, Richard, who's not on screen, and all of our colleagues across the Business Schools for Climate Leadership Network. So given that we're out of time, I don't want to say much more other than perhaps we as business schools can do our part in making a difference, not only doing our own work, but in joining forces in research, teaching, convening, and stewardship. So please join us tomorrow for our next and final webinar in this series, October 26th at 12:30 UK time, where I will be joining Knut and our colleague from LBS, Professor of Economics, Lucretia Reichland, to discuss the role of accounting in driving change in business around climate. You can join that discussion and also watch all of our prior webinars on our website, bs4cl.org. Thank you all for joining, and you have a wonderful day, and let's keep climate in the front of our minds, because it's one of the most important things we need to address. Thank you all.